I parked my car a few blocks from the dealership, taking a deep breath before stepping onto the sun-baked pavement of suburban Houston. The morning sun reflected off the polished hoods of luxury vehicles lined up like trophies, and I felt the familiar knot of unease twist in my stomach. I had been here before, but never like this, never knowing my own family would turn a public space into a stage for my embarrassment. My brother-in-law, James, leaned casually against the front desk with that half-smug, half-patronizing expression that made me grit my teeth. His tone was sharp even from a distance, a warning I already sensed in the pit of my stomach. I stepped through the dealership doors, heels clicking against the pristine tile. Employees glanced up, curiosity flickering across their faces, and a few customers paused mid-conversation. Sensing tension but unsure where it came from, I straightened my shoulders, reminding myself silently, respect is earned, not given. The mantra carried me a few steps forward until James's voice cut through the buzz of activity. "You need to leave," he said, his words blunt, directed at me like a command rather than a suggestion. My stomach sank. Heat rose to my face. The staff turned their attention toward us, and even the customers watched, puzzled. I could feel every pair of eyes weighing me, judging me, but I refused to let my anger show too quickly. There was humiliation here, yes, but also strategy. I wouldn't hand him the satisfaction of an impulsive reaction. Instead, I allowed a small, controlled inhale, the way I had learned to ground myself before any critical negotiation. Then the owner stepped forward, his brow furrowed, scanning the scene with quiet curiosity. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice neutral but carrying enough weight to make James shift slightly, momentarily unsettled by an authority he couldn't dominate. I met the owner's gaze, and for a second the world slowed. I could feel the subtle tremor of power dynamics between the three of us. My brother-in-law's arrogance, the owner's neutrality, and my own carefully contained defiance. A flashback hit me. Family dinners where my accomplishments were glossed over, the quiet undermining of my promotions, my ideas dismissed as naive. Each slight etched itself into the foundation of who I had become. The sting of those memories fueled a quiet determination now, one that demanded careful navigation rather than impulsive retaliation. I focused on the rhythm of my breathing, the mantra repeating in my head, steadying me as the moment threatened to collapse into chaos. The staff whispered among themselves. A few customers glanced over, some with thinly veiled pity, others with curiosity laced with judgment. I caught one young salesman's sympathetic glance and nodded imperceptibly. No words, just acknowledgement. I could feel the social pressure pressing in, reminding me that any sudden outburst could harm not just my dignity, but my reputation. I had to be clever, measured, observant. My eyes drifted to the keychain dangling from the receptionist's counter, a small metallic reminder that this place, these symbols, could later serve as evidence. Not yet, but soon. I filed the thought away. A small seed of anticipation planted beneath the hum of tension. Everything here, every gesture, every word, every smirk would be remembered and used strategically when the time came. James's posture tightened, his voice slightly louder, more commanding, but I remained still, letting his anger do the work of exposing him. The owner, still observing, tilted his head slightly, curiosity softening into a quiet, unspoken question that challenged me more than James ever could. "Are you going to stay or leave?" The weight of that question pressed down, a quiet suspense that made every muscle in my body tense. I could feel the undercurrent of family history, power, and unspoken rules flowing through the room, an invisible thread connecting the public humiliation to something larger, more consequential. I took another measured breath, straightened my jacket, and allowed a faint, calm smile. I wasn't leaving, not yet. Not until I understood the full scope of what this moment meant. Not until I had turned the tables in a way only experience and careful observation could permit. The whispers continued, the luxury cars gleaming, the morning sunlight striking metal and glass with a harsh brilliance, and I held my ground, quietly resolved. The streets of my neighborhood felt unusually quiet as I drove away from the dealership. The hum of my tires on asphalt, echoing the lingering churn in my chest. The morning sun had climbed higher, spilling light over the neat suburban homes, but it did little to warm the tight knot of humiliation and simmering anger inside me. I gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, feeling the tension stretch along my shoulders. James's sneer replayed over and over in my mind, and with it, the realization that his influence wasn't confined to the dealership. It extended through our family, shaping perceptions, manipulating interactions, and undermining any attempt I made to assert myself. I pulled into a quiet side street and parked, letting the engine tick down as I exhaled slowly. The confrontation wasn't just embarrassing, it was an indictment of how I had been consistently undervalued. Every slight at work, every overlooked suggestion, every dismissal of my ideas flashed across my memory, each one sharpening a clarity I had refused to see before. I recalled the meeting where a colleague presented my project as their own, the offhand remark at last year's family gathering where my efforts were brushed aside, and the whispered comments suggesting I was too sensitive. Each memory reminded me of a recurring pattern, one that demanded not retaliation in the heat of the moment, but careful, deliberate strategy. Pulling my phone from the console, I opened my notes app, not to write anything yet, but to plan. I ran through mental calculations, what had happened, who had witnessed it, what tangible evidence could be gathered. Every movement, every glance, every word exchanged today could be a puzzle piece later. A message flashed across the screen, nothing urgent, but it served as a reminder that observation was key, that recording details, no matter how small, would provide leverage when the time came. I thought about the family dynamics that threaded through every interaction, the favoritism, the subtle power plays, the way comments could sting without leaving visible marks. I remembered Aunt Clara's veiled praise for James while minimizing my own achievements, Uncle Robert's silence when I spoke up, the barely perceptible eye rolls from cousins who seemed to take pleasure in my discomfort. Each gesture, each offhand remark, told me the battlefield was larger than the dealership floor. I had to map it carefully, understand where the tension lay, and discern who could be allies or potential witnesses in the unfolding drama. My hands relaxed slightly on the steering wheel as I allowed myself a quiet assessment of my own response. I had maintained composure at the dealership, observed carefully, and avoided giving James any satisfaction. That restraint was not weakness, it was strategy. I reminded myself, patience and intelligence would outlast arrogance and impulsiveness. I reviewed the subtle cues I had noted, the way staff shifted uncomfortably when James raised his voice, the flicker of curiosity in the owner's eyes, the subtle, supportive glance of a junior employee. Each one could play a role in how the situation evolved, and each required careful consideration. I glanced at the dashboard clock. Early afternoon, time to return home and continue this internal mapping. I drove slowly, allowing the movement to settle my thoughts. The hum of the engine became background to a mental checklist. Document, observe, anticipate, and wait. The quiet streets gave me space to plan without distraction. The phone, the little notebook I kept in my bag. These objects became symbolic anchors for what I intended to do next, keep a record, gather evidence, and position myself to respond when the stakes were higher. Pulling into my driveway, I paused, gripping the steering wheel again, but differently this time, not with tension but with resolve. I could sense the shift within me. Embarrassment had not won. Anger had been harnessed into focus. I reminded myself that intelligence and composure were my weapons. Impulsive retaliation was for those who had nothing else to wield. My family's long-standing hierarchy, James's overbearing presence, the subtle machinations of relatives, none of it could undermine a carefully constructed response. I would act when the moment demanded it, with evidence, with witnesses, and with the authority that came from patience. As I stepped into my house, my phone buzzed. A new email, brief, nondescript, but loaded with potential implications, something about family arrangements, a meeting, a hint of secrets that had long been obscured. I didn't open it immediately. I allowed myself a small, private smile. The game was becoming clearer, and for the first time since morning, I felt not just anger, but control. My mind was already charting possibilities, potential allies, and the pieces of leverage I would need. The afternoon sun spilled through the blinds onto my desk, highlighting the planner I kept, the notes I would make, the careful record of what had transpired today. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling it slide down my throat, steadying the tension still lodged in my chest. My mind ran through what had been said, what had been unsaid, and what had been left hanging in the dealership's bright, air-conditioned halls. There was anticipation, but it was measured. There was determination, but it was quiet. I could wait, I could observe, and when the moment came, I would not be caught off guard again. Every slight, every whisper, every look would have its counter, carefully calculated and unassailable. The soft glow of the evening settled over my home office as I sank into the chair, the day's tension still clinging to my shoulders. Outside, the streets of Houston were dimming, a calm that contrasted sharply with the storm of thoughts racing through my mind. I opened my laptop and glanced at the notifications on my phone, each ping a reminder of the threads I needed to pull together. James's smirk from the dealership lingered in my memory, a catalyst for the meticulous observations I was about to undertake. I had resolved not to react impulsively, and now, in the quiet of my home, I could focus on gathering the evidence that might one day level the playing field. I started with a methodical review of recent dealership communications, emails, invoices, and transaction logs. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but a few anomalies caught my eye. A string of client emails that didn't align with the official schedule, slight discrepancies in service records, and notes tucked away in shared folders that hinted at preferential treatment. My pulse quickened, not with panic, but with alert anticipation. Each irregularity suggested patterns of manipulation, subtle but deliberate, and I began to document them meticulously in my notebook. The pen felt heavy with purpose as I recorded each detail, a silent ledger of observations that would form the foundation of any future confrontation. As I stepped out later, a sense of tension prickled along my spine. I wandered the nearby streets, casually observing movements at the dealership from a distance. James emerged periodically, confident and unassuming. Yet each glance he cast, each interaction he had with staff, now carried a weight I understood fully. He was not just arrogant, he was calculating, creating narratives, influencing perceptions, controlling the flow of information. I noted down license plates, who entered which offices, and what conversations were overheard. This quiet reconnaissance was methodical, deliberate, and it fueled a growing sense of strategic anticipation. Every detail I captured felt like a small victory, a piece of leverage that James could never suspect I was gathering. Back at my desk, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The simmering anger I had felt during the dealership confrontation transformed into a focused determination. I recalled the countless times I had been undervalued, projects co-opted, ideas dismissed, efforts minimized, not just by family but in professional contexts as well. Patience wins where anger fails, I whispered under my breath, a mantra that guided me as I arranged the observations into categories: direct manipulations, subtle favoritism, and potential witnesses. I recognized that my intelligence and restraint were not weaknesses but tools I intended to use with precision. The evening deepened and a soft chime on my phone drew my attention. A brief email from an unknown sender hinted at documents that had been misplaced or deliberately hidden, and my pulse quickened. I sensed the emergence of a broader web of intrigue that extended beyond James, a subtle suggestion of hidden alliances and perhaps betrayals. My mind mapped the possibilities, calculating risks, assessing potential leverage points, and considering who might be unwittingly useful in corroborating my observations. Each revelation, however small, added weight to my quiet empowerment. By the time I stood at the window, watching the last traces of sunlight fade, I felt a shift within me. No longer merely reactive, I was preparing for action, albeit measured and deliberate. The notebook beside me, the pen in my hand, and the phone within reach were more than tools. They were extensions of my strategy, symbols of patience and foresight. I reminded myself repeatedly that impulsive confrontation would serve no one. Only careful, methodical preparation would yield results. A knock at the door startled me. I opened it to find a plain envelope slipped under the threshold, unmarked but weighty with implication. My heartbeat quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. Inside, a single document hinted at financial irregularities and concealed communications, enough to deepen the mystery and raise the stakes for what lay ahead. This small discovery, arriving unbidden, confirmed the pattern I had suspected. The family and the dealership were more entangled than I had realized, and James's influence was only a part of a larger puzzle. I placed the envelope carefully in my planner, feeling the tension sharpen and the evening stretch ahead with unspoken possibilities. Each piece of evidence, each observation was a step toward clarity, toward control, and toward the subtle empowerment I had been cultivating. The day had ended, but the investigation had just begun, and I was ready to meet whatever came next with the quiet precision that had carried me through humiliation and into insight. The mid-afternoon sun slanted through the dealership's large windows, casting reflections across the polished floors, and I felt its glare mirror the tension simmering inside me. I had returned not as a shaken outsider, but as someone determined to observe, to understand, and to act with precision. The air smelled faintly of leather and motor oil, but beneath that I sensed a web of unspoken power plays, one that James, my brother-in-law, orchestrated with subtle authority. Every glance exchanged among the staff felt like a coded message, a hint at loyalties and biases I had yet to unravel. I approached a young sales associate, someone who had handled the paperwork during my last visit, and spoke casually, masking my intent behind a polite inquiry about inventory. His eyes darted nervously, betraying an awareness I hadn't expected. Hesitation hung in the air, and then, almost accidentally, he revealed a detail, a pattern of preferential treatment for certain clients tied to James's personal relationships. My pulse quickened, not from surprise, but from the validation it offered. Here was proof that the subtle manipulations I had suspected extended beyond ordinary business practices. They were embedded in the very culture James controlled. Moving deeper into the office, I found a folder tucked carelessly behind other files. Inside were emails and notes hinting at financial maneuvers that favored his interests at the expense of fairness. I thumbed through each document with deliberate care, noting inconsistencies and aligning them with what I had observed earlier. The frustration I felt over years of being undervalued flared briefly, but I allowed it only enough to fuel my resolve. These were not just anomalies, they were evidence of a pattern, a deliberate hierarchy maintained through manipulation. My mind raced through potential uses for these findings, weighing the ethics and the timing of every move. As I navigated the conference room, subtle glances from other staff caught my attention. A slight stiffening of posture and avoided eye contact, small gestures, but each one told a story. I recognized the undercurrent of family influence extending into the professional sphere. The realization was sharp. Any action I took would ripple through both personal and professional networks. I felt the familiar mixture of irritation and alertness, the careful monitoring of my own reactions to avoid tipping my hand prematurely. Timing, I reminded myself, was everything. Patience had always been my ally. I retreated to a quiet corner with a hidden USB drive I had kept from earlier investigations. Plugging it into my laptop, I cross-referenced new data with previous notes. Patterns emerged, preferences, offhand financial adjustments, small but deliberate oversights. I paused often, reflecting on the lessons learned from prior family interactions. Confrontation without preparation could backfire, but careful strategic planning could shift power. Without direct exposure, every decision, every observation was a chess move. I had to anticipate counteractions before they happened. A sudden vibration from my phone pulled me from my thoughts. An anonymous tip had arrived, vague but pointed, hinting at deeper deceptions within the dealership's operations. My stomach tightened, a mixture of suspense and anxiety. The stakes had escalated, and yet, beneath the tension, a quiet confidence had begun to settle in. I had navigated embarrassment and manipulation, and now, armed with insight and evidence, I was ready to leverage these truths with intelligence. The afternoon sunlight waned, but my focus sharpened. What lay ahead required not anger, but calculated resolve. Every movement, every glance, and every hidden fact collected today would serve as a foundation for the challenges looming in the chapters to come. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall glass windows of the dealership, casting long shadows across the conference room floor. I had rehearsed my approach in my mind countless times on the drive over, and yet a twinge of tension knotted in my stomach as I stepped past the reception. The air carried a subtle hum of activity. Phones ringing, printers whirring, muted conversations. But beneath it, I could sense the undercurrents of unease, as though the walls themselves knew the storm I was about to stir. James's presence loomed, felt more than seen, his influence whispering through staff behaviors and guarded glances. I drew a slow breath, reminding myself that I controlled my pace, my words, and my focus. I found the staff member I had identified as a subtle link to James's inner circle and approached with a careful, measured tone. "I just wanted to clarify something about last week's records," I said, letting the casual phrasing mask my intent. The young associate's eyes flickered with recognition, hesitation softening into guarded acknowledgement. I allowed a slight pause, letting my presence linger just long enough to convey awareness without direct confrontation. A few well-chosen comments about transparency and fairness prompted a nervous fidget, and in a fleeting slip, the associate admitted to minor manipulations favoring certain clients, details previously hidden from me. A flicker of vindication warmed my resolve, but I tempered it with caution. Public justice required careful maneuvering. I retreated briefly to a quiet corner and examined the flagged documents I had collected over the past few days. scanning emails and memos that corroborated the subtle revelations I had just heard. Each notation told a story of favoritism and maneuvering that extended beyond casual oversight. Patterns emerged, deliberate and insidious. My mind catalogued possibilities, weighing moral obligation against strategic patience. Could I confront James directly, or would that provoke an unnecessary backlash? Every previous encounter with family had taught me that timing, clarity, and discretion were as crucial as courage. I adjusted my plan, mentally prioritizing the collection of evidence and observation of reactions over hasty action. As I moved through the dealership, minor staff interactions reinforced what I had suspected. Loyalties were divided, and some eyes followed me with quiet scrutiny, measuring my intentions. A misplaced folder, intentionally or not, caught my attention, and I left a subtle note tucked within its pages. A quiet signal that I was aware, attentive, and unwilling to be dismissed. Each micro-action was part of a larger chessboard, positioning me strategically without betraying my hand. Anger simmered just beneath the surface, balanced by a calculated restraint that demanded awareness of both ethical boundaries and personal integrity. I will act when the moment demands it, not when impulse dictates, I reminded myself. A brief phone vibration drew my attention to an incoming message, a cryptic note from an unknown sender, hinting at missteps and hidden allegiances within the dealership. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. I understood that this escalation was more than a confrontation. It was an awakening of latent tensions, a moment where moral clarity intersected with strategic acumen. My gaze swept across the polished floors and organized desks, imagining the chain of reactions that my subtle interventions might trigger. By asserting my awareness, even discreetly, I had shifted the balance enough to unsettle, yet not enough to invite retaliation. I exhaled slowly, letting the late afternoon sun wash over me as I reflected on the small victories and looming uncertainties. Every note left, every glance measured, and every withheld word had been intentional. I was not merely reacting, I was steering, quietly asserting a moral and professional standard while preparing for the inevitable ripple effects. The staff's murmurs and cautious exchanges hinted at the unsettled waters beneath calm surfaces. I felt a quiet empowerment settle over me, a patient, determined readiness to confront the broader pattern of deceit and favoritism when the time was right. Today's subtle warnings had planted seeds. Tomorrow would determine which would take root. The early evening sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of the dealership, reflecting off the sleek cars that lined the showroom. I paused at the edge of the main floor, letting my eyes sweep over the space, noting the subtle tension in the staff's posture and the faint flicker of unease in James's glance across the room. Everything was deliberate, the hum of conversation, the shuffle of papers, but beneath it lay a pulse I could feel, the awareness that my presence, my attention, had already begun to unsettle the carefully maintained balance of control. I approached James directly, letting the calm in my stride convey as much as my words would. "We need to talk about how things have been handled lately," I began, steadying my voice, each syllable carefully measured. His eyes narrowed, recognition of my purpose mingled with irritation. I held his gaze, letting him understand that I wasn't merely raising a complaint, I was asserting boundaries, making it clear that repeated slights and manipulations would not pass unchallenged. A staff member nearby stiffened, and I sensed the ripple effect of my quiet confidence across the room. My hands rested briefly on the edge of the conference table, letting my documents remain visible, a silent indicator of preparedness and attention to detail. James reacted swiftly, subtle yet pointed, questions in meetings, reassignment suggestions, small public remarks intended to embarrass. Yet each action he took was met with my careful observation. I noted his patterns, his allies, and vulnerabilities, cataloguing them mentally for later use. My frustration surfaced momentarily, a quick flare of indignation at his arrogance, but I allowed it to fuel strategy rather than rash action. Each interaction, each calculated gesture strengthened my resolve. Patience, not impulse, would determine the outcome. At a quiet moment, I withdrew to a side office, reviewing flagged emails and notes from the past few weeks. Patterns of favoritism, subtle manipulations, and concealed communications revealed themselves in stark relief. I reflected on my moral responsibility, balancing the desire to assert justice against the need for careful navigation. Ethical clarity became a weapon, guiding my actions with a precision that anger alone could never achieve. I reminded myself of lessons from earlier family dynamics. Timing, observation, and the strategic deployment of information were more powerful than public confrontation. A minor incident, a misfiled document, glanced at by an unsuspecting staff member, provided the perfect opportunity to reinforce awareness without escalation. I allowed my gaze to linger on it, signaling attention without accusation. Moments like these built a network of quiet leverage, demonstrating both competence and control. Each subtle move reinforced my internal mantra. Strategy outweighs impulsivity, observation precedes action, and patience wins where anger fails. As the evening shadows lengthened, I sensed that the confrontation had already shifted the energy within the dealership. Staff exchanges were more cautious, small hesitations revealing cracks in James's once seamless authority. I walked the showroom floor deliberately, acknowledging inquiries with calm assurance, reinforcing a presence that balanced assertiveness and professionalism. Every step, every glance, every measured interaction was a testament to the lessons I had internalized over the years. Awareness, restraint, and the quiet accumulation of leverage. A notification on my phone broke the momentary rhythm. A brief, cryptic message hinting at another layer of oversight or a previously unnoticed connection. My pulse quickened not with panic, but anticipation. The confrontation had set in motion a series of responses I was now equipped to monitor, evaluate, and, when appropriate, counter. Tonight had not been about victory, but about establishing position, asserting principles, and signaling that I was no longer passive. The stakes were clear, and I was ready for the unfolding consequences. Every action intentional, every move calculated, every response anchored in strategy and moral clarity. Late afternoon light spilled through the tall windows of the dealership boardroom, casting long reflections across polished mahogany tables. I sat back, notebook open, reviewing the sequence of events I had meticulously recorded over the past weeks. Each detail mattered: the timing of calls, the hesitant glances, the subtle shifts in staff allegiance. James, my brother-in-law, thought he had anticipated every move, but the truth was that I was no longer reacting. I was shaping the game. I traced patterns, connecting dots that had seemed isolated before. A misfiled email here, a whispered comment there, a favor granted unjustly. Each revealed his underlying vulnerabilities. I realized that his manipulations weren't just petty acts. They were strategic miscalculations, leaving cracks wide enough for me to exploit. The thrill of seeing the landscape with clarity energized me, but I tempered it with patience. Every observation, every note I took was calculated for maximum leverage. The key was to act decisively when the moment was right, not impulsively. Testing boundaries became my next step. I approached interactions with James subtly, raising questions that seemed casual but were loaded with implications. How would he respond? Would staff side with him or hesitate under my quiet, unwavering presence? Each reaction was another piece of the puzzle. I noticed 2 assistants lingering near the conference table, their expressions betraying newfound curiosity. They were aligning slowly with what they sensed was the emerging truth. My leverage was growing not through force but through insight and observation. Ethical questions lingered in my mind. I could expose everything at once, creating immediate upheaval, but that would risk my credibility. Instead, I chose silent precision, letting moral integrity guide strategy. Each decision reinforced my personal code. Act with intelligence, act with foresight, and maintain control. I remembered lessons from my professional life, how restraint and timing could turn potential disasters into opportunities. The stakes weren't merely professional, they were deeply personal, intertwined with family dynamics I'd long endured. As the sun dipped lower, shadows lengthened across the parking lot, and the atmosphere shifted. Small, calculated gestures, documents left where eyes would catch them, brief pauses in conversations, strategically timed questions, built tension without overt confrontation. I felt the subtle shift in power, an unspoken acknowledgement that I was no longer invisible or underestimated. Every interaction carried weight, and the rhythm of my planning accelerated, preparing for the moment when strategy would convert into action. By evening, the boardroom was quiet, yet charged. I reviewed the evidence, ensuring nothing was overlooked. Emails, recorded communications, notes from staff conversations. Each item was a thread I could pull when the time came. The anticipation was controlled, a quiet excitement tinged with the gravity of what lay ahead. I knew that Chapter 8 would demand action, but tonight was about mastery, understanding the battlefield, knowing my allies, and ensuring that when the confrontation came, it would unfold on my terms. Patience, precision, and strategic awareness had brought me to this turning point, and nothing would derail the plan now. The showroom lights reflected off polished chrome as I stepped in, heart steady, mind clear. Months of observation, planning, and quiet endurance had led to this evening. I carried the folder containing the evidence, emails, spreadsheets, and notes that mapped James's patterns of manipulation and favoritism. Every eye on me, from staff hovering near the conference room to a few lingering customers, added weight, but I let it anchor my focus rather than distract me. This was the moment where patience met action. I began by presenting the discrepancies in financial records, pointing out inconsistencies with calm authority. "Here's the pattern," I said, voice steady. "Overtime allocations, client prioritization, and approvals all favor certain individuals, leaving others systematically disadvantaged." Reactions flickered across the room: surprise, doubt, curiosity. James stiffened, caught off guard, attempting a quick rebuttal, but my evidence left little room for manipulation. I noted every shift in expression, every hesitation, cataloging his responses as meticulously as I had his previous missteps. As the tension thickened, James tried to regain control, throwing out threats thinly veiled as professional concern. His voice sharpened. "You're making assumptions that could damage reputations." I held my gaze, replying without aggression but with unmistakable firmness. "This isn't about assumptions. These are facts, and everyone here deserves transparency." The room held its breath, the balance of power tilting unmistakably toward careful, methodical truth. I paused, letting the weight of evidence settle. Staff members exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, acknowledging the integrity of the presentation. Minor allies, people who had quietly observed, who had sensed inequities, leaned toward subtle support, their presence amplifying the impact. I could feel the psychological shift. The careful groundwork of prior chapters had created a foundation that was now unshakable. James attempted one last maneuver, a desperate effort to twist perception, but each claim I countered with documented evidence. The contrast between his reactive aggression and my composed strategy made the truth clear to all present. Pride mingled with a quiet relief. For the first time, the months of subtle endurance, patient observation, and tactical thinking bore fruit in full view of witnesses who mattered. Even as I concluded the presentation, internal reflections reminded me of the stakes beyond this confrontation: family dynamics, moral integrity, and the personal growth that had brought me here. Triumph was tempered with awareness. This was decisive, yet not the end. Some battles were already shifting beyond the boardroom, and I sensed that the final layer of consequences had yet to unfold. The room buzzed with energy, some faces flushed with revelation, others rigid with discomfiture. I stepped back, allowing the space to breathe around. The impact of truth fully revealed, knowing that this moment would resonate far beyond tonight. As I walked out, the room still buzzing, I realized some battles were only just beginning. Morning light filtered through the blinds as I sat at the kitchen table, the folder of resolved disputes neatly stacked beside me. For the first time in months, a sense of calm settled over my thoughts, mingled with the quiet pride of having navigated the storm. The dealership's challenges, James's manipulations, and the tense family dynamics were no longer looming shadows, but chapters that had shaped my approach and reinforced my resilience. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth ground me, a tangible reminder of how far I had come. I arranged a final meeting with key family members and staff, a neutral space where lingering issues could be addressed without escalation. James was present, subdued, the weight of his prior missteps clear in his posture and expressions. I approached the discussion with measured calm, confirming accountability without hostility. "We've reviewed all the records and interactions," I said, voice steady, "and it's clear that fairness must guide our next steps. Transparency and integrity are non-negotiable." The room listened, some nodding quietly, others absorbing the moral clarity in the statement. James acknowledged the accountability without overt protest, the tension softened, and the path for closure began to take form. Reflecting on the journey, I recognized the growth that had emerged from adversity. Months of strategic observation, tactical planning, and quiet patience had honed my judgment, strengthened my moral compass, and reinforced my self-respect. Conversations with allies and supportive family members reaffirmed the importance of trust and loyalty, while the setbacks reminded me that vigilance and assertiveness must coexist with empathy and ethical grounding. I understood now that resilience was not just about withstanding external challenges, but about mastering internal responses, staying grounded in values even amid chaos. The afternoon sunlight warmed the room as I considered the future. Career goals, personal ambitions, and the quiet influence of maintaining fairness all took shape with renewed clarity. I reviewed the remaining documents and notes, symbolic remnants of the battles fought, and integrated them into a coherent plan that would safeguard both professional integrity and family relationships. The process of moving forward felt deliberate and empowering, a conscious choice to step beyond past grievances while retaining the lessons they had imparted. Even as resolution settled, subtle awareness lingered, a quiet understanding that life would continue to present challenges, and that assertiveness, strategy, and ethical vigilance were ongoing responsibilities. The experience had forged a framework for handling conflicts with intelligence and composure, a blueprint that would guide decisions and relationships going forward. In these moments of reflection, I felt both grounded and capable, the weight of past humiliations replaced by the clarity of hard-earned wisdom. I stood, gathering the final folders and notes, and looked out the window at the bustling streets beyond, a symbolic boundary between what had been and what could be. The air was filled with the ordinary sounds of life moving forward, yet in that ordinary rhythm I sensed extraordinary potential. Every challenge, every misstep, every confrontation had led to this equilibrium, a place of assertive confidence, moral clarity, and personal agency. I stepped away from the table, shoulders squared, heart steady, ready to embrace the next chapter of life with vigilance, strength, and hope. I walked away, not unscathed, but unbroken, ready for what life still had to teach me.